Ever wondered what it would be like to keep secrets so heavy they could alter the fate of an entire kingdom? How it would feel to bear the weight of such knowledge pressing on your chest with every breath? The dawn was cold, with wind whispering through the palace hall like a chilling murmur, carrying unspoken secrets. Henry, a veteran guard with graying hair and watchful eyes, felt a shiver down his spine. He tried to convince himself it was only the cold, but decades of vigilance had trained him to sense the subtlest of signs, the slightest unusual movement in the stillness of the night. The palace hall, typically a place of grandeur and splendor during the day, took on a completely different atmosphere under the night's veil. The rich tapestries adorning the walls seemed to come alive, their embroidered figures dancing in the shadows cast by the flickering torchlight. The marble floor, polished to a shine, reflected the soft glow of moonlight filtering through tall windows, creating a mesmerizing pattern of light and shadow. Henry straightened, feeling the familiar weight of his armor on his shoulders. The cold metal against his skin was a constant reminder of his duty. His eyes, accustomed to the dimness, scanned the room with the precision he had acquired over years of dedicated service. That's when he saw it. A hooded figure slipping quietly along the hall's edge, their footsteps muffled by the dark carpet stretching down the corridor. Henry's heart quickened, but his years of training kept his breathing steady and his movements calculated. It wasn't the intruder's audacity that caught Henry's attention, but rather the calmness with which they moved, like someone who knew the palace halls and corners intimately. Each step was deliberate, avoiding creaky floorboards and patches of moonlight that might reveal their presence. Without hesitation, Henry placed a hand on the hilt of his sword, feeling the worn leather beneath his calloused fingers. The familiar weight of the blade was comforting, a silent reminder of his oath to protect the palace and its inhabitants. Moving silently, he began to follow the figure, maintaining a safe distance and controlling each breath. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, laden with tension and mystery. Henry could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but years of training kept his expression calm and his focus sharp. His eyes never left the figure ahead, observing every movement, every hesitation. The figure soon vanished down a corridor leading to the king's private library, a sacred place within the palace filled with ancient knowledge and the kingdom's secrets. A knot formed in Henry's stomach. Whatever the intruder was after, it certainly wasn't trivial. When Henry reached the door, always locked, he found it left slightly ajar, a silent invitation to the unknown. A thin line of pale light escaped through the crack, dancing across the stone floor of the corridor. Henry hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the sword's hilt. He knew that whatever lay beyond that door would change everything. With a nearly inaudible sigh, he carefully pushed the door open, the soft creak of the hinges sounding like a scream in the night's silence. Peering inside, his eyes widened at the scene unfolding before him. The intruder knelt before a bookshelf, their gloved hands feeling along its side as if searching for a hidden mechanism. The light from a single candle, strategically placed on the floor, cast dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. Henry held his breath, his body tense as a bowstring. He knew he should act, confront the intruder, but something held him back, as though he were on the verge of witnessing something he wasn't meant to see. And then, it happened. The intruder moved a book, and with a click that seemed to echo throughout the library, part of the shelf slid aside, revealing a hidden passage. The air escaping from the opening carried the scent of ancient secrets and buried truths. Henry leaned back slightly, pressing his back against the cold wall, watching as the figure disappeared down the secret passage. The sound of footsteps faded, mingling with the rapid beat of his heart. When the shelf slid back into place with another soft click, he stood there for a moment, absorbing what he had just witnessed. The library, now silent once again, looked different through Henry's eyes. Every shadow hid a potential secret, every book a possible key to another world concealed within the palace walls. As the night wore on, Henry remained there, his mind filled with unanswered questions. He knew that what he had seen that night would change not only his life, but possibly the fate of the entire kingdom. The question echoing in his mind was, what would he do with this knowledge? The wind continued to whisper through the palace corridors, now carrying not just secrets, but also the weight of the choice Henry would have to make. The night was still long, and the palace's secrets were only beginning to reveal themselves. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a secret that could change everything? How would you bear such a burden, knowing that every unspoken word could mean the difference between order and chaos? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to keep secrets so heavy they could alter the fate of an entire kingdom? What it would feel like to bear the weight of such knowledge pressing on your chest with every breath? The dawn was cold, with the wind seeping through the palace hall like an icy whisper, carrying with it untold secrets. Henry, a veteran guard with graying hair and watchful eyes, felt a shiver run down his spine. He tried to convince himself it was only the cold, but decades of vigilant service had taught him to sense even the subtlest signs, the slightest unusual movement in the night stillness. The palace hall, typically a place of grandeur and splendor during the day, took on a completely different atmosphere under the night's veil. The rich tapestries adorning the walls seemed to come alive, their embroidered figures dancing in the shadows cast by the flickering torchlight. The marble floor, polished to a shine, reflected the soft glow of moonlight filtering through tall windows, creating a mesmerizing pattern of light and shadow. Henry straightened, feeling the familiar weight of HE. The cold metal against his skin was a constant reminder of his duty. His eyes, accustomed to the dimness, scanned the room with the precision acquired over years of dedicated service. That's when he saw it, a hooded figure slipping quietly along the hall's edge, their footsteps muffled by the dark carpet stretching down the corridor. Henry's heart quickened, but his years of training kept his breathing steady and his movements calculated. It wasn't the intruder's audacity that caught Henry's attention, but rather the calmness with which they moved, like someone who knew the palace halls and corners intimately. Each step was deliberate, avoiding creaky floorboards and patches of moonlight that might reveal their presence. Without hesitation, Henry placed a hand on the hilt of his sword, feeling the worn leather beneath his calloused fingers. The familiar weight of the blade was comforting, a silent reminder of his oath to protect the palace and its inhabitants. Moving silently, he began to follow the figure, maintaining a safe distance and controlling each breath. With every step, the air seemed to grow heavier, laden with tension and mystery. Henry could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, but years of training kept his expression calm and his focus sharp. His eyes never left the figure ahead, observing every movement, every hesitation. The figure soon vanished down a corridor leading to the king's private library, a sacred place within the palace filled with ancient knowledge and the kingdom's secrets. A knot formed in Henry's stomach. Whatever the intruder was after, it certainly wasn't trivial. When Henry reached the door, always locked, he found it left slightly ajar, a silent invitation to the unknown. A thin line of pale light escaped through the crack, dancing across the stone floor of the corridor. Henry hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the sword's hilt. He knew that whatever lay beyond that door would change everything. With a nearly inaudible sigh, he carefully pushed the door open, the soft creak of the hinges sounding like a scream in the night silence. Peering inside, his eyes widened at the scene unfolding. The intruder knelt before a bookshelf, their gloved hands feeling along its side as if searching for a hidden mechanism. The light from a single candle, strategically placed on the floor, cast dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. Henry held his breath, his body tense as a bowstring. He knew he should act, confront the intruder, but something held him back, as though he were on the verge of witnessing something he wasn't meant to see. And then, it happened. The intruder moved a book, and with a click that seemed to echo throughout the library, part of the shelf slid aside, revealing a hidden passage. The air escaping from the opening carried the scent of ancient secrets and buried truths. Henry leaned back slightly, pressing his back against the cold wall, watching as the figure disappeared down the secret passage. The sound of footsteps faded, mingling with the rapid beat of his heart. When the shelf slid back into place with another soft click, he stood there for a moment, absorbing what he had just witnessed. The library, now silent once again, looked different through Henry's eyes. Every shadow hid a potential secret, every book a possible key to another world concealed within the palace walls. As the night wore on, Henry remained there, his mind filled with unanswered questions. He knew that what he had seen that night would change not only his life but possibly the fate of the entire kingdom. The question echoing in his mind was, what would he do with this knowledge? The wind continued to whisper through the palace corridors, now carrying not just secrets but also the weight of the choice Henry would have to make. The night was still long, and the palace's secrets were only beginning to reveal themselves. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a secret that could change everything? How would you bear such a burden, knowing that every unspoken word could mean the difference between order and chaos? The sun had barely risen when Henry, with deep circles under his eyes and a heavy heart, made his way to the captain of the guard's office. The corridor leading to the office felt longer than ever, each step echoing like a forewarning of what was to come. The captain's office was a reflection of the man who occupied it, austere, organized, and intimidating. Detailed maps of the kingdom covered an entire wall, pinned with markers and cryptic notes. A sturdy bookshelf housed ancient tomes on military strategy and kingdom laws. In the center, a massive oak desk dominated the room, stacked with meticulously arranged reports. Captain Aldrich, a middle-aged man with a prominent scar cutting through his left eyebrow, looked up from the document His piercing gaze seemed to drill into Henry's soul. "Henry, what brings you here so early?" The captain's voice was grave, carrying the weight of authority. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the heavy air of the office fill his lungs. "Sir, I need to report something unusual that I witnessed last night." As Henry recounted the events of the early hours, he closely watched the captain's reactions. At first, Aldrich listened with a neutral expression, but as the account progressed, Henry noticed a subtle change. The captain's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and a vein pulsed at his temple. When Henry mentioned the secret passage in the library, he saw something he had never expected in his superior's face: fear. It was only a flicker, quickly masked, but unmistakably there. When Henry finished his account, the silence that followed was oppressive. The captain rose slowly, walking to the... For a moment he stood with his back to Henry, his silhouette framed by the morning light. "Henry," Aldrich began, his voice strangely controlled, "you have been a loyal guard for many years. Your service to the crown is invaluable." Turning, the captain fixed Henry with an intense look. "But what you're suggesting, a secret passage in the royal library, that's impossible. It must have been an illusion, a trick of light and shadow." Henry felt a chill run down his spine. The captain's vehement denial didn't match the fear he had seen in his eyes moments earlier. "Sir, I know what I saw. It was no illusion." The captain sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if trying to push away a headache. "Henry, I understand your concern, but believe me when I say there cannot be a passage in the royal library. That is mere fantasy." But Henry knew what he had seen. His voice was unwavering as he replied, "With all due respect, Captain, what I saw was real, and if there's a hidden passage, it means the palace's security is compromised." The captain approached him, placing a heavy hand on Henry's shoulder. His tone took on an almost paternal note with a hint of underlying warning. "Henry, you are a good man, an exemplary guard. Don't ruin your reputation by chasing shadows. Forget what you think you saw. It's better that way, but for all of us." Henry felt the weight of those words, understanding what was left unsaid. Something was wrong, and judging by the captain's behavior, Henry realized the secret might be covered up not just by someone within the palace, but possibly by the very highest ranks. Leaving the office, Henry felt heavier than when he had entered. The corridor seemed to close in around him, the walls whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows no longer offered the usual comfort. Instead, it seemed to expose every shadow, every dark corner where secrets might lurk. At that moment, Henry made a decision. If he couldn't trust his superiors, he would have to unravel this mystery on his own. The weight of responsibility settled over his shoulders, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. As he walked back to his quarters, Henry began to plan. He would observe every guard, every servant, every noble who circulated near the king. He would pay attention to every furtive glance, every whispered conversation. The palace, which had been his home for so long, now seemed like a labyrinth of secrets and lies. And Henry was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Over the following days, Henry plunged into a world of constant observation and growing paranoia. The palace, once a symbol of security and order, had transformed into a maze of suspicions and whispered secrets. Henry meticulously observed the habits of every guard and servant near the king. His eyes, trained by decades of vigilance, now turned on his own companions. He noticed details that would once have passed unnoticed, the way young Squire Marcus always appeared nervous near the throne room, or how Lady Alara, the Queen's advisor, frequently disappeared for hours without explanation. One particularly tense morning, Henry was stationed near the entrance to the royal apartments when he noticed an exchange of glances between two guards. It was subtle, a nearly imperceptible nod, a spark of mutual recognition that lasted only a second. But to Henry, it was like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. What was that? He wondered, feeling his heart race. Were they part of the conspiracy? Or was he seeing things where there was nothing? As the days passed, Henry became aware of anxious looks directed at him, of whispers that abruptly stopped when he approached. The palace air felt thick with tension, as though an invisible storm were about to break over everyone. One afternoon, while patrolling the palace gardens, Henry overheard a whispered conversation coming from behind a neatly trimmed hedge. He approached silently, his years of training allowing him to move without a sound. "We can't go on like this," said a female voice laced with anxiety. "If someone finds out—" "No one will find out," replied a male voice, firm and authoritative. "We have everything under control. The plan is proceeding as expected." A chill ran down Henry's spine. He wanted to move closer, to discover who the conspirators were, but he knew the risk was too great. Heart pounding, he withdrew as silently as he had arrived. That night, lying on his narrow bed in the guards' quarters, Henry couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry hidden meaning. He mentally replayed every detail he had observed over the past few days, trying to piece together an increasingly complex puzzle. That's when he noticed something strange. A small folded piece of paper, almost invisible, lying just under his door. With his heart in his throat, Henry rose silently and picked up the note. He unfolded it with trembling fingers, his eyes widening as he read the elegantly written words. "Trust no one." The already palpable tension in the air seemed to increase exponentially. Henry glanced around as if expecting to see the author of the message hidden in the room's shadows. But he was alone, with only his doubts and fears for company. Who had left that note? Was it an unknown ally trying to warn him, or a trap intended to deepen his paranoia? The possibilities swirled through his mind like a storm. Henry carefully tucked the note into a hidden compartment of his chest, a place he used to store his most precious belongings. Now that scrap of paper joined his most intimate memories, a tangible reminder of the danger surrounding him. In the days that followed, every interaction, every exchanged glance in the palace took on a new significance for Henry. He observed everything and everyone with a critical eye, looking for signs of betrayal or loyalty. One morning, while on his usual patrol, Henry noticed something unusual. Captain Aldrich, normally so punctual and methodical, appeared agitated. His hands trembled slightly as he held some documents, his eyes darting around as if he feared being watched. Henry approached casually, pretending to examine a nearby tapestry. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the captain slide one of the documents into his tunic, glancing nervously around before hastily walking away. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. What could be on that document that the captain was so careful to hide? His mistrust of Aldrich since their conversation about the secret passage only grew. That night, lying in his bed, Henry made a decision. He could no longer remain a passive observer. It was time to act, to seek answers actively. But how could he do so without exposing himself? How could he navigate this sea of secrets and betrayals without drowning? As sleep finally took him, Henry dreamed of endless corridors, doors that led nowhere, and shadows that came to life. In his dream, he was running, chasing a hooded figure who always seemed one step ahead. When he woke, drenched in cold sweat, Henry knew that time was running out. He needed to uncover the truth, whatever the cost. The kingdom's fate might depend on it. With the first light of morning creeping through the window's cracks, Henry prepared for another day of vigilance. But this time he would not be merely a passive observer. It was time to dive deep into the palace's secrets, even if it meant risking everything he knew and loved. The night fell over the palace like a velvet shroud, dotted with stars that shone through the tall windows. Henry, with a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, decided it was time to act. He could no longer be just a passive observer of the events unfolding around him. Moving silently, the product of years of training and experience, Henry positioned himself in the same corridor where, days ago, he had witnessed the mysterious intruder. The air was thick with tension, as if the palace itself knew that something significant was about to happen. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Henry remained motionless, hidden in a dark alcove, his hand firmly on the hilt of his sword. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of ancient wood settling or the distant hoot of an owl. When the early hours were already advancing and Henry was nearly ready to give up, an almost imperceptible sound caught his attention. Light footsteps, so soft they could have been mistaken for the whisper of the wind, echoed down the corridor. There was the intruder again, moving with the same feline grace that Henry had observed before. This time, Henry did not hesitate. In a swift, precise movement, he stepped out of his hiding place, blocking the intruder's path. The hooded figure tried to retreat, but Henry was already too close. "Stop where you are," Henry commanded, his voice low but full of authority. The intruder froze, like a shadowed statue in the dimly lit corridor. For a moment, time seemed to stop, the tension in the air so thick it could have been cut with a knife. In one quick motion, Henry pulled down the intruder's hood, his heart racing in anticipation. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Standing before him was Lady Alara, one of the Queen's advisors, known for her discretion and supposed loyalty to the crown. Her eyes, usually calm and calculating, now gleamed with a mixture of surprise and something else. Defiance, perhaps. "Lady Alara," Henry whispered, incredulous. His mind whirled, trying to process this unexpected revelation. But she only smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You should have stayed out of this, Henry. Now there's no going back." Before Henry could respond, a movement to his right caught his attention. Another guard emerged from a side door. It was Captain Aldrich himself, his face a mask of disapproval and something Henry had never seen before: fear. "Henry," the captain said, his voice laden with regret, "you shouldn't have disobeyed me. Now, we have a problem." Henry felt the world spinning around him. His superiors, the people he trusted to maintain the kingdom's security, were involved in something dark. The realization hit him like a blow to the stomach. "What is happening here?" Henry demanded, his hand gripping his sword tighter. "Are you betraying the crown?" Lady Alara stepped forward, her posture relaxed in contrast to the palpable tension in the air. "Treason is such a strong word, Henry. We prefer to think of it as a realignment of loyalties." The captain sighed heavily. "Henry, there are things happening in this kingdom that you do not understand, things that go beyond simple notions of right and wrong." Henry looked from one to the other, his mind racing to find a way out. He was outnumbered, surrounded by people he once considered allies. Every muscle in his body was tense, ready for action. "You won't get away with this," Henry declared, his voice firm despite the fear threatening to consume him. "The truth will come out." Lady Alara laughed, a melodious sound that echoed ominously down the corridor. "Oh, Henry, do you really think you can fight this? Fight us?" At that moment, more guards emerged from the shadows, surrounding Henry. He realized with a heavy heart that many of them were men he had served with for years, men he considered friends. Captain Aldrich stepped forward, his expression a mixture of regret and determination. "I'm sorry, Henry. I truly am. But now you know too much." Henry knew his chances were slim. He was outnumbered, outmatched. But something inside him refused to surrender. In one swift movement, he drew his sword, the sound of metal slicing through the air like a cry of defiance. "I swore to protect this kingdom," Henry declared, his voice ringing through the corridor. And that's exactly what I'll do, no matter who I have to fight." The sound of more swords being drawn filled the air. Lady Alara stepped back, watching the scene with a cool interest. Captain Aldrich seemed to hesitate, a shadow of doubt crossing his face. And so, in the heart of the palace he had sworn to protect, Henry found himself facing not just external enemies, but those he had once called allies. The kingdom's fate, he realized, could very well be decided there, in that dark corridor, in the early hours of the morning. As the tension reached its peak, and the first move of the imminent battle was about to be made, Henry couldn't help but wonder, how had things come to this? And more importantly, was there any way to save not just himself, but the entire kingdom from this web of betrayal and secrets? The air in the corridor grew dense with the tension of the imminent battle. Henry, with his sword in hand, faced his former companions, now turned foes. The gleam of the blades reflected the faint torchlight, casting a sinister play of light and shadow. "It doesn't have to be this way," Captain Aldrich said, his voice weighed down with regret. "Put down your weapon, Henry. We can talk this through." But Henry knew there was no going back. "Talk? About how you've betrayed everything we swore to protect?" Lady Alara took a step forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and pity. "Oh, Henry, your loyalty is admirable but so poorly directed. Don't you see we're doing this for the good of the kingdom?" Her words only strengthened Henry's resolve. With a swift move, he struck the nearest guard, catching him off guard. The sound of metal on metal rang through the corridor as the others advanced. Henry fought with the skill and precision honed over years, but he was clearly outnumbered. He managed to down 2 guards, but soon found himself cornered. A blow struck his arm, making him drop his sword. "Enough!" Captain Aldrich shouted. "Detain him!" 2 guards seized Henry, immobilizing him as he struggled. Lady Alara approached, her face a mask of calm. "You could have been part of this, Henry," she said softly. "Now we'll have to keep you contained." Henry was dragged to the palace dungeons, a place he rarely visited in his duties as a guard. The smell of mold and dampness filled his senses as he was shoved into a dark cell. The heavy iron door slammed shut, its sound echoing in the empty chamber. Days passed, each one slower than the last. Henry lay on the hard cot, replaying events in his mind, trying to understand how it had come to this. The silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water and the clanking of distant chains. In his solitude, Henry began to question everything he believed in. Could Lady Alara and Captain Aldrich truly be acting for the kingdom's benefit? Or was that just an excuse for their betrayal? One night, when the darkness seemed thicker than ever, Henry heard footsteps approaching his cell. The door creaked open and Lady Alara entered, her face partially hidden in shadows. "Wondering why, Henry?" she asked, her voice tinged with melancholy, as if there were genuine regret in her actions. Henry stood slowly facing her. "Why betray everything we swore to protect?" Lady Alara sighed, leaning against the damp wall of the cell. "The crown demands loyalty, while turning its back on us. For years I served without question, until I discovered what they hide. The king himself..." She hesitated, a flash of resentment in her eyes. "He isn't what he appears to be." Henry felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "We've decided our kingdom needs a true leader, a fair king who cares about the people. This is the purpose of the alliance we're forming, and you, Henry, have become an obstacle." Her words echoed in Henry's mind, challenging everything he had believed. Before he could respond, Lady Alara continued, "Think on it, Henry. You have time now. Think about the greater good." With that, she left, leaving Henry alone with his turbulent thoughts and an impossible decision before him. Days passed, and Henry felt his resolve wavering. Lady Alara's words lingered in his mind, mingling with his own doubts. But something inside him refused to accept betrayal as the only way forward. Then he noticed it. The cell door was not fully locked. Whether by carelessness or intention, there was a chance for escape. Henry waited until the dead of night when the guards would be least alert. With his heart racing, he pushed the door slightly. It opened with a soft creak. Henry held his breath, hoping the sound hadn't alerted anyone. Silence. Moving carefully, he stepped out of the cell. Navigating through the dark corridors of the dungeon, Henry used his knowledge of the palace to avoid the guards. Every shadow seemed to hide a danger. Every distant noise made his heart pound. Finally, he reached one of the palace's main corridors. The familiar sight filled him with resolve. But there was no time for sentiment. He needed allies, answers. Henry sneaked to the quarters of the few guards he still trusted. Gently, he woke his old friend Thomas, a guard who had always been loyal and honest. "Henry?" Thomas whispered, incredulous. "What's going on? They said you had deserted." "It's a long story, my friend," Henry replied, his voice low and urgent. "But I need your help. The palace is full of traitors, and the king may be in danger." Thomas hesitated only a moment before nodding. "You can count on me." Together, they woke a few more trusted guards, sharing Henry's story in hurried whispers. With each revelation, their faces showed a mix of shock and determination. "We need to act quickly," Henry concluded. "Lady Alara and Captain Aldrich are planning something big, and I fear it's against the king." With a small group of allies by his side, Henry felt a spark of hope. But he knew the real challenge was yet to come. They needed to uncover the conspirators' full plan, and most importantly, alert the king. As the group prepared to act, Henry couldn't shake Lady Alara's words about the king not being what he seemed. What did she mean by that? And how did it fit into the larger plot unfolding around him? With the first rays of dawn filtering through the palace windows, Henry and his allies prepared to face the day that might change the fate of the entire kingdom. The truth was within reach, but the price for reaching it could be higher than any of them imagined. The small group led by Henry moved silently through the palace corridors, each step calculated to avoid detection. The goal was clear: reach the king's chambers before the conspirators could act. "Thomas," Henry whispered, "you and 2 others go to the west wing. Keep an eye out for any movement from Lady Alara or Captain Aldrich." Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "And you?" "I and the others will head straight to the king's quarters. We must warn him before it's too late." As the group split, Henry felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every decision, every move could mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death. As they neared the royal chambers, the tension in the air was palpable. The guards loyal to Henry were nervous, their hands gripping their sword hilts tightly. Suddenly a shout echoed down the corridor. "Intruders, guards, to your posts!" Henry's heart pounded. They had been discovered. "Run!" he shouted to his companions. "We need to reach the king now." The sound of boots and clanking armor filled the air as guards loyal to the conspirators closed in on their position. Henry and his group sprinted, their breath heavy as they raced down the ornamented corridors. Finally, they reached the large golden door leading to the king's quarters. Without hesitation, Henry pushed it open with all his strength. The king, awakened by the commotion, was standing, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Henry quickly knelt, catching his breath. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but your life is in danger. There are traitors in the palace plotting against you." The king's face paled. "Traitors? Whom do you mean?" Before Henry could respond, the door swung open again. Lady Alara entered, followed by Captain Aldrich and a group of guards. "Ah, Henry," Lady Alara said, her voice cold as ice. "I see you've decided to make things interesting." The king looked from Henry to Lady Alara, confusion evident on his face. "What is happening here? I demand an explanation." It was at that moment that Henry realized the look in the king's eyes wasn't just confusion. There was fear there, deep and old. And then, Lady Alara's words echoed in his mind. The king isn't what he seems. The truth, Henry realized, was far more complex than he had imagined. And now, in the center of this web of lies and secrets, he would have to make a choice that could change the fate of the entire kingdom. A heavy silence followed. The king, Lady Alara, Captain Aldrich, and Henry stared at each other, each one carrying the weight of unspoken secrets. It was the king who finally broke the silence. "Lady Alara, Captain Aldrich, what is the meaning of this? Are you behind all this?" Lady Alara took a step forward, her face a mask of determination. "Your Majesty, the time has come for the truth. The kingdom cannot continue like this. The captain furrowed his brow, thoughtful. But how would we govern? A kingdom without a king is like an army without a general. Henry took a step forward, feeling it was time to speak. Perhaps that's exactly what we need. Not a kingdom ruled by one, but by many. A council, perhaps, elected by the people. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with possibilities and unspoken fears. The king stood up slowly, walking over to the window that overlooked the vast kingdom beyond the palace walls. "All my life," he began, his voice low but firm, "I was taught that a king's duty is to protect his people, no matter the cost. I believed the pact was necessary, that the sacrifice of a few would save many." He turned to face the group, his eyes filled with determination. "But now I see I was wrong. The true sacrifice must come from me." Lady Alara approached him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your Majesty, are you certain? Once done, there's no going back." The king nodded, a sad smile on his lips. "It's time for the people to take control of their destiny. If my abdication can break this cursed pact and give the kingdom a chance for true prosperity, then so be it." Henry felt a wave of respect for the man before him. Despite past mistakes, the king was willing to sacrifice everything for the good of the realm. "What about the people?" Captain Aldrich asked. "How will we explain all of this to them?" "With the truth," Henry replied resolutely. "They deserve to know. They deserve to choose their future." In the following days, a flurry of preparations ensued. Messengers were dispatched to all corners of the kingdom, summoning representatives from every town and village to a great assembly. The day of the assembly arrived with a cloudy sky, as if the weather itself sensed the weight of the moment. The grand square before the palace was packed with a sea of eager and confused faces. The king ascended the podium, his crown gleaming one last time in the soft light. Beside him stood Henry, Lady Alara, and Captain Aldrich, united in their determination to change the course of history. "My people," the king began, his voice echoing across the silent square, "for generations, our kingdom has prospered, but at a terrible cost. Today I stand before you not as a king, but as a man who acknowledges his mistakes and seeks redemption." And so, before a stunned crowd, the king revealed the truth about the pact, the hidden sacrifices, and his decision to end it all. "From this day forward," he concluded, removing the crown from his head, "I am no longer your king. The power now lies in your hands. Together, you will decide the future of this kingdom." A murmur swept through the crowd, a mix of shock, fear, and surprisingly hope. Henry observed their reactions, his heart pounding. This was only the beginning of a new journey, one that would transform the realm in ways no one could predict. As the former king descended from the podium, Henry couldn't help but reflect on how it had all started with a simple guard witnessing a mysterious figure in the palace corridors. Now he was at the center of a peaceful revolution that would reshape the future of an entire nation. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges and possibilities. But for the first time in a long while, it was a future the people themselves would build, free from the shadows of the past. Henry smiled, feeling the weight of recent months lifting. The true work was just beginning, but he was ready. They all were. And so, as stars began to dot the night sky, a new era truly began. One of cooperation, freedom, and endless potential. An era that started with a humble guard observing a mysterious figure in the palace corridors, and that now stretched beyond the horizon, promising a brighter tomorrow for all.